Alright, so today we're getting to the more, some of the more applied topics that we're talking about. So what we had yesterday, you'll be able to see in various ways how that, I think, helps to inform and provide you with some background to what we're talking about today. But I want to just really begin by going straight into this practical question of what are our obligations to the global poor, without particularly theoretical background, and then we'll talk about that as an issue, and then maybe some of the more theoretical stuff will come into that later on. So if you've read the reading that how much should a billionaire give and how much should you give, you will have noticed I give a very quick sketch of a little story that I've been using since I first began writing about this topic, which is way back in the 1970s. But I'll repeat it even though you've already got it, just to set the framework and then ask some questions about it. So you imagine that you're walking through a park, you pass a shallow ornamental pond, you see something splashing around in the pond, you're curious to what it is, you go closer and you see that it's a small child. You look around to say, well, who's looking after this child? Where's the parents or the babysitter? It can't be a toddler like this around by themselves, but there's no one else to be seen. There's only you and the toddler. So your next instinctive response is to say, this child is in danger of drowning, I better do something about the child. So you run down to the pond to get to the child before the child drowns. As you run, the not so noble thought strikes you that by bad luck just this morning you've put on your most expensive pair of shoes you bought quite recently. They're something, a pair that you really like. They're going to be quite expensive to replace. You don't have time to kick them off as you run. That might be just the crucial moment in which the child breathes his last. So then you have another thought, well, am I responsible for this child in any way? I didn't push the child into the pond, I don't know who the child is is a stranger. Do I really have to ruin my shoes in order to save a child who I've had nothing to do with? And as I say in the article, and it's happened most people say, well, yes, you do have to rescue the child, even though you're going to ruin your nice shoes. So, let me just pause and check whether that is in fact your reaction, whether somebody wants to take issue with that at this point. I'm happy to consider views that say there's nothing wrong with saying it's not my child and I don't want to ruin my shoes. Well, I'll take silence as either that you in fact do think it's wrong, or else that there's an intimidating presence in the room that makes it difficult for you to speak up, but I hope that it's in fact just that you actually do think that it's wrong. It would be wrong to be wrong. So, if you agree with that, then that does suggest that that we have some obligations to help strangers to, if we can do so, at modest cost to ourselves. It doesn't have to be zero cost, that's why the shoes are in there. On the other hand, you know, if I'd said the pond is infested with crocodiles, then no doubt a number of you would have thought that, well, you don't really have an obligation to risk your life to save the child. So, what we can get from that, I think, is the idea that if we can help someone, if we can do something that is really important, and we assume that saving a child's life is really important, at a modest cost to ourselves, then that's something that we ought to do. And here's that situation, saving the child's life at a modest cost to ourselves. Obviously, this example is designed to suggest a parallel of some sort. And the parallel is the fact that although it's very unlikely that we'll ever come across an unattended child drowning in a pond, we do right now live in a world in which there are something over or around 8 million children who are dying every year from avoidable poverty-related causes. That 8 million or so comes to over 20,000 a day. So it's a very substantial number if you think about that kind of number of children. And the other important claim, I think that's a fact that really no one will dispute, or you might say, oh well, the estimate's a bit out, but whether it's 6 million or 10 million, there's a very large number of children dying, avoidable poverty-related deaths. I don't think that's a dispute. The next claim, of course, that's important is that there is something that you can do to prevent at least some of those deaths. And obviously, talking about an expensive pair of shoes, I'm suggesting that the cost of saving a life might be somewhere around that kind of figure. So that's whether that premise is true is something we can talk about. Obviously, that's a purely factual premise, really. Whether there are organisations that you can give to that will, with a high degree of probability, use the extra funds they receive in ways that can save a child's life, or, it doesn't have to be a child. The child is just, for the point of view of the parallel, save an adult's life, or maybe achieve other really important things, restore sight to someone who is blind, make it possible for children to be educated, sorts of things that are really important moral goods, I think, that we would all agree of as really important moral goods. And that there are organisations that are effectively working to promote. Which is not to say that all organisations are effectively doing that. There's a huge number of organisations in the field of international aid. So it does take a little bit of work, I think, to try and find which are the most effective ones. But fortunately there are other organisations now doing some of that work, so you don't have to do it entirely on your own. While the figures that you get vary a little bit as to how much it costs to save a life, depending on who you're talking to, certainly the amounts are not really very large in terms of the incomes of most reasonably affluent people in affluent countries, of the countries that I guess all of us come from. So the general question then is, well, does this mean that we have an obligation to contribute to helping people in extreme poverty, specifically to save lives or to achieve other goods? And if we're not doing that, are we in the same moral situation as the person who sees the child in the pond but says, I don't want to ruin my shoes, and walks on? And obviously, I put it that way because just about everybody agrees that it would be wrong to ignore the child in the pond and walk on because you didn't want to ruin your shoes. And yet, we live in a world in which, although there are a large number of affluent people, most people give either nothing or very little to international poverty. So, the first question to ask, I guess, is what's going on here? I mean, is there something wrong with the argument? Is there something wrong with the parallel between the two that can show why it's a mistake to think that if you think that it's wrong to walk past a child, you should also think it's wrong not to give significantly to these organisations that are helping people in poverty? Or is it not that the moral argument goes wrong, but there's something else going on that is at an explanatory level rather than at a normative level in terms of what's happening? So let me pause at this point. There's a variety of other things that I want to say, but let's see what you think about it at this issue and where we'll go from there.
I'm inclined to say the parallel holds, but I wanted to maybe throw out a counter argument, which I don't endorse, but I'm aware that even recently visiting faculty members at EGS have advanced this argument that when we engage in charitable giving, somehow an unintended consequence is that we ameliorate the circumstances of the recipient's suffering to a degree that we actually prolong structural inequalities to sort of keep them oppressed. And so I guess maybe in some sense we're harming future persons who might otherwise have grown sufficiently discontent with their lot in life that they might have undertaken dramatic social change. And that somehow charitable giving is thus an impediment to authentic, lasting change. Again, I don't think I endorse the argument, but for what it's worth, I thought I'd sort of throw it out there and see where it goes.
Good, thanks for putting it out. Is there anyone else who wants to speak on that? Maybe,
Yeah, I would like to add something to what he said. Because by doing this, by contributing to charity, you are like excluding the states, public organizations which are really responsible for that, for this and that. Exactly by doing charity.
Sorry, which organisations we exclude? The states, you said?
I mean the states, huh?
So, like the government of the impoverished country, is that what you mean?
Yeah. Their governments, and also international organizations like NOU and so on.
The United Nations.
Yeah.
The United Nations, the total resources of the United Nations are, significantly less than, say, the New York City Police Department. So I don't quite see how the United Nations is really supposed to solve global
the
problems.
United Nations, which are so big, so huge, has a beautiful history behind it, can do anything. How can a very small ONG of charity do?
Well, I mean, there is no one in the world, no individual, not even Bill Gates, who can single-handedly solve the problem of global poverty. But that wasn't what I was really suggesting. I was suggesting that there are, as in the case of the child in the pond, there is at least one child, you may never know which child it is, and that's certainly a difference between the child and the pond case, who you have the resources to help.
But that's a very specific and concrete situation.
Right.
I think that in conditions like this, you don't have to think to solve the problem. You just do it. And
Okay.
I think that most of the people are doing like this. You see a child at risk, you just take the child out of the water. But if the child are not in our field of immediate experience, it's different. So there is the necessity of the mediation of some organizations to do this kind of help. And which organizations should do it? I think that by contributing, for example, to charity, you are like de-responsabilizing the states and over-responsabilizing the individuals, which is a very neoliberal argument which I don't agree at all.
Okay, let's hear somebody else on this. Yeah, we have other people around. We'll start with you, Vincent.
I guess there's that suspicion, and I think oftentimes it's true, where charitable organizations, NGOs, are linked to multinational corporations who we feel are responsible for poverty. So I guess it becomes...
What's the link between charitable organisations and multinational NGOs, multinational corporations?
Well, I guess, they fund some of that, or they do kind of an advertising along with charitable organizations.
Not in my experience. I mean, yes, there's advertising campaigns, like there was this thing in the US called Red, where if you bought something at various clothing stores, they gave 10% of the cost, what you paid, or something or other. But if you're talking about the major charitable organisations like Oxfams or Save the Children, or world vision or care. They're not really promoting multinational.
But are they? But aren't they? I mean, I don't know, but aren't some of the organizations dependent on, say, donations from multinational corporations? Or?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, the one that I know best is Oxfam. They're certainly not dependent on it. They basically get a lot of donations from a very large number of people. Obviously, there's some wealthy people who give them more because they can afford to give more, but they're not really particularly tied to any multinationals.
I'm Manuel. I don't think it's that obvious to save the child because there was a story in the newspaper recently about somewhere in China that a child got run by a motorcycle, and the peasants just knew that the child was in agony, and they just keep walking, and the child died. So, that makes me think that it's not that obvious that when you're near this kind of situation to help someone, it's not reactionary. Like completely, it's not intuitive.
Yes, I don't know if other people have seen that video. You can find it. The town is called Foshan, F-O-S-H-A-N, and if you Google Foshan and child or something, you'll find the video. I must say it's pretty horrible. It's very disturbing to watch. But you're right, of course, that people seem to pretend not to see the child, and to some extent in the video, and walked on. And it's horrible. There was when that video was shown on a Chinese television station, and then of course on the internet, and it did provoke a huge reaction of people who said this is awful. What's happened to the morality of the Chinese people and so on, including Chinese. I'm not saying this is not just an outside reaction. So people still felt negatively about it, but maybe you're right that it does suggest that we shouldn't automatically assume that everybody would help the child.
Because it also happened like someone was drowning in the river, and they were just like watching it.
I don't know. Jack was next.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that plays into it for sure is like maybe a crowd mentality sort of thing. For example, in 2008 when in a suburb of New York on Black Friday after Thanksgiving, the Walmart worker opened the door and people wanted to get in so bad that they trampled him to death, and they killed him and they injured some pregnant women. And I mean, it's not like anybody said ooh, I'd really rather have my TV 10 seconds sooner, but let him live. No one consciously thought that, but just in the situation they were in, the fact that they were all part of this big mass, they almost couldn't stop him and do anything.
Yeah, that's true. That's, I guess, a fairly specific situation where, in a way, once you've got this crowd behind you, you can't do anything. But what I thought you were going to say when you mentioned the crowd is it's true that if there's a crowd of people around, we seem to feel that we have less responsibility individually. And that's the difference, perhaps, between the world poverty situation and the child in the pond. Because, as I described it, there's only you and the child. So you can see that if I don't rescue this child is probably going to drown. In terms of the global poverty situation, you say, well, yes, there's 8 million children who need to be saved, but there's 1 billion affluent people, so, why is it my responsibility? It could be anyone's responsibility. So that, I think, operates psychologically as a difference to make it less likely that we'll actually do something about global poverty rather than save the child. But I don't see it as actually a kind of a moral justification for not doing it, because if you look at the situation, you know that even though there are 1 billion affluent people, and they would have the resources really to save all of these 8 million children, it's not happening. So the children are still dying, and that's part of why your contribution can still make a difference. Who was that this side, Michael?
I thought I should just briefly talk to the and the incident in Fushan, and especially brought up the crowd. There's a whole lot of complexities there dealing with cultural issues in China. It's in place, it's essential at the moment. I think one of the most important ones is that in thinking about the crowd, there's not this straight dichotomy between the crowd and the individual, the community and individual. That's normally you place the family before the individual and then before the community. So in the sense of giving, like we're talking about now, if you were to give away $10,000 US, you would be taking $10,000 away from your family. That's the rational logic playing out, and that was the rational logic playing out when these 17 people walked past the child, because they were afraid they were going to get accused of having caused the damage in the first place and then being made to pay for the medical bill. But then to come back to the parable, what I find troubling about the parable is that there's, in the first case of the drowning child and then giving the money, with the child drowning, they're in our experience and they're in our area of action. We can do something. And in terms of giving money, they're outside of our experience and they're outside of our action. We can just give money. We can't contribute with our body or our skills or something like that. So I mean, I find that slightly problematic. I have no problem with giving money and spending even through governments. I think we do give money through governments, and so that I guess what I'm trying to advocate is, instead of the first action being giving money to charities, which distance ourselves from the problem, is to engage. If you're a doctor, go and do something. And one thing I found is it's very hard without skills to offer help from abroad. But once you arrive in the area, you can actually do. There's so much to do. But I guess if you're a billionaire, your skill is money. So.
Even if you're not a billionaire, but suppose that you're just a professional who can earn, I don't know, let's say, let's say in a month you could earn $10,000, right? That's not at all unusual, people with professional skills. But you're not a doctor or anything like that, so you have specific skills. I really question whether you could do anything as useful in a month by going to an impoverished country as $20,000 given to an effective aid organisation could do.
I accept that. I mean, my argument isn't one or the other. But in the $20,000 that you give, obviously some needs to be taken out for administration, and that's going to be substantial, depending on which organisation. But I think a lot of the groups that go with doctors and dentists and other, let's just keep it in the health sphere, they need non-dentists and doctors, to do work which is very, very, very significant, very simple manual labour, which is very hard to attract.
They do, but, well, I mean, that's what there usually is in poor countries, right? There is unskilled manual labour that you can hire for $5 a day.
With the translation skills or the ability to work with, the idea of making instruments clean. I mean, there's a cultural thing that you can bring. I just think as we can bring skills.
Okay, one comment. So, do you mean that you do not see a straightforward result of your help when you give money to a charity organization and then the money floats somewhere and the result is not at your hand? Is it what you mean?
I mean, you could argue that, but that's not my argument. My argument is that by giving money, you maintain that distance between the pond and yourself.
Yes, but the distance sometimes is unavoidable, right? I mean, in the situation I am now, I cannot do anything but to send.
And I don't argue against that at all. I just say that maybe the first position of action should be direct action, and then the first step should not be giving money, should be thinking about how you can go there on the ground, contribute, and also bring that knowledge back so that.
Okay, but what if I cannot?
No, well, yeah, absolutely. Then giving.
Because you say that it should be first. So.
You're saying that's the first thing you should think about. You should ask yourself, is there something that I can do hands-on? But if the answer is no, if the answer is, well, I've got a job, I've got to work, I've got small children, I can't leave,
Absolutely.
then giving money may be the right thing to do.
Absolutely.
So we'll keep going around the room, or we'll start again.
I think that there's a central discrepancy, or I would locate a lot of what's motivating the comments here in the, so like what does motivate the difference, what accounts for the difference rather, between a child dying in a small pond in front of you and a child dying of a preventable illness in some place that you're not in. To me, it is, the problems are just as urgent. The child's life is the same in both cases. Your ability to effectuate change or to intervene in the situation is arguably, substantially the same in both cases if you assume that giving money can immediately save the child's life in some other place. So really it's an aesthetic difference, and I would suggest. And that raises for me the sort of secondary ethical question of the role of bridging that aesthetic gap, of doing what's almost like a, you could call it advocacy or raising awareness or whatever you want to call it. I think it's also a role for philosophy in illustrating how the urgency of the situation of children, abroad, such that it does have the sort of aesthetic urgency of a child dying right in front of you. That seems to be the sort of task at work here, and that goes to Tiago's point and to your point as well. I mean, I think that the intent is similar, and I think that there's very little disagreement from what I've heard about the equivalence of the of those two situations. It's really a matter of bringing one into the same sort of place as the other in terms of that which can inspire action. I sort of suggest that.
Okay, Tiago, I can see you've got your hand up. You want to respond exactly to what Alex said? Because Josh, I think, also wanted to get into the discussion. But if you
No,
direct, no?
you can do it.
Okay, so Josh, why don't you want to say something?
It just seems much more complicated to me than this, and I guess this is going to be my problem with these examples. You save the child in the pond, you ruin your shoes. The other example is much more complicated. There's systemic issues of consumption included. There's an indication of greed, guilt that is used to, push people to donate money like this. My experience of NGOs in Lesotho, tiny little country that's steeped in NGO money, is rampant corruption. Not only with the NGOs, but with the government organizations that these NGOs are working with. So you're literally getting sense that people are actually getting cents on the dollar, which is something that's well known and documented. I would be interested to know if someone did a study and said that your Dell computer was equivalent to 10 children living in poverty. Would you still continue to use the computer? And I think that this can be done with a number of the products that we consume and where the constituent parts come from. I think that's maybe a similar question that points to the systemic problems that we are living in, and the complicated web of relations that our massive consumption can do to children or others living in other countries.
If I've understood you correctly, I think you've made two rather distinct points. One is that because of endemic corruption in poor countries, very little of what you donate will actually get to help the people who need it. The other was a point rather about consumption, which you assume is contributing, that the consumption in the developed world is contributing to poverty in the developing world. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, I mean corruption not only with the government officials of that country, but with the NGOs themselves.
Yeah, but they're separate points, right? When you talked about my Dell computer, you weren't just suggesting I should sell the Dell, get $1,000 and give it to these people. You were suggesting that something in the manufacture of the Dell was contributing to poverty. Is that right or not?
Yeah, the consumption of the Dell computer there is a relation there that needs to be explored. Also, the Dell computer could be your pair of shoes.
one exception. I mean, if Peter didn't have computer, then he could not write his books, then he could not sell them and give the money as he does to charity.
Right.
Okay? I mean,
But these
that's a very interesting question, and a lot of people are talking about it, that if you really want to help people and work for charities and so on, the best thing you can do is to get to the bank, be a banker or whoever, earn a lot of money and give the money away, right? I mean, because if you are poor yourself in a way, then although you can contribute, as you said, so you can go as a doctor, work with the people at those places, but usually that doesn't happen. Usually you need something to use, so to work well, to earn money, and only then to give it away.
No, I agree, but that's a choice steeped in that same scenario for me of the shoes. Like, what are we willing to give up in order to possibly encounter poverty ourselves to help another person? If we go to another country, it might be an issue of buying a plane ticket, it might be an issue of losing our jobs on this side, it might be an issue of giving up our material comforts. Are those costs that we're willing to make in order to possibly help someone directly? And I think for most people, including myself often, that's not the case.
Well, I think you're right that we are talking exactly about, how much should we be prepared to give, and that is going to, that's something I certainly want to explore. But I guess before we even get to that point, we have to get to the conclusion that yes, we are under an obligation to give something, and so at this stage, I think we're still discussing that.
But I think it needs to be paired with a discussion about these relations as well.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, and I think, obviously you've worked in Lesotho and I haven't, so you know more about that situation than I do, but I think there are organisations which do not work through governments, but work directly with people at the village level, have people in the field seeing that what they're doing is actually going to the people or providing the health clinics or the medicines or the schools or the vaccinations, the sanitation, whatever it might be. So I wouldn't accept that in general if you give to effective aid organisations, so those aid organisations where people have done some research and tried to work out which ones are really best at translating your dollars into helping people. I wouldn't accept that in general there's only a tiny fraction of what you're giving that is making a difference.
No, but an interesting thing is that I would always watch the NGOs come to the village that I was stationed in, and they would always come in the big Land Rovers. And this is an interesting thing to me, that often these NGOs are operating with material comforts, that they're attempting to alleviate poverty while still maintaining their material comfort. I'm not making a judgment on it, I just think it's interesting.
Well, if you want to have really good people working out there, these are people who no doubt could be having a very comfortable life in an affluent country, and where they would be earning a lot more money than they're getting from the NGO. And I think it's asking a huge amount of them to say you ought to be living at something like the level of people in the country that you're working with. I mean, you won't even be maximally effective because you won't be able to get to the villages that easily. Like them, you have to walk. So maybe you do need a Land Rover. Maybe it's a useful tool to get to where you want to be. Now let's keep going around.
Yeah, I'm not sure anybody here disagrees that there's an obligation to help people in poverty. It's just a matter of how to go about it. Like, I would propose the analogy, if you see someone in front of you who's in respiratory distress, of course you're going to give them CPR. But, I mean, there are tens of thousands of people suffering from TB. And I think you could make a valid argument that it's a better idea to fund research, like for antibiotics, rather than pay for respirators. And I see that as somewhat equivalent to giving to charity, with buying the respirators, that is.
Certainly, Bill Gates put a lot of money into research to try to develop a vaccine for malaria. So if you're putting money into research that is directed towards the diseases that kill people in developing countries, I possibly as effective as giving it to organisations that are working in those countries directly to help people. I don't have any.
I guess the argument I'm making is that I think it's possible to see poverty as a symptom rather than the disease itself.
Okay, but if we agree that it's a bad thing, and if you see it as a symptom, that suggests, well, there's a cause, right? So then the question is, can we do anything about the cause? This gets back to Tiago's point, I think, to some extent. Can we do anything to change the causes of poverty? Now, that would be another option, right? If you believe that you have a view of what the causes of poverty are, and if you think that there's some way in which you can make a difference there, so you say, look, I'm not giving to the Oxfams and Save the Children's and UNICEF's. I'm giving to those organisations that are trying to change the system so that there's not large-scale poverty in the world. Again, I don't have a problem with that at all. I'd love to know which of the organisations or which of, how you actually deal with the causes of global poverty, because I haven't really seen any clear accounts of how that might be changed.
I said I'd love to know too.
Yeah, good, right. Yeah.
I'll tell a story today. Amen. Okay, so it will be a story to you and to Tiago. So in 81, I was 6, and we had, what do you call it in Italian? In 81?
Yeah, martial law.
Martial law. Okay, we got the martial law. Sorry, I forgot English. So anyway, there was, believe me, nothing in shops. Nothing. I don't think that we can say that Poles were dying out of hunger. That didn't happen because we still had a lot of country workers and food there. But you could not buy in shops really anything. And what happened at that time, there was a huge movement in Europe, especially in Germany, to help Poland. And it was not based on organization level, but on people, families who started sending packages to Polish families. And that's what happened to us. And that's why every day, believe me, every day we got food, toilet paper, soap, shampoo, and so on. And I don't think of that time, which was hard for the country, as anything bad. If anyone thought that we should first get rid of communism, or that there should be any organizations that should help on the country level, or change the government and so on, we would never get the help, right? I mean, people would live in not tragic conditions, of course, but in bad conditions, and we would not get the help. Fortunately, people wanted to help us despite those things, and they did. So I think that's a good argument against thinking that because certain things should be changed in politics and in governments and so on, then we shouldn't help, because it doesn't work like that, of course. And there are such huge problems that we cannot influence, as me, who doesn't work in politics and so on.
Tiago, did you want to respond to that?
Not exactly to this, but I would like
To the earlier discussion?
Yeah, I have, well, some problematizations of how the question is being included here.
Okay.
I think that the question of poverty is not being really well addressed through this ethical and almost individual approach. Well, I come from a country which is not very rich. We're getting better, but we still have a lot of poverty. So when you put the question as you are using expensive shoes, and well, I think that in Brazil, most of the people are not using, the people who could contribute to charity are not using expensive shoes. They don't got it yet.
Sorry,
So
isn't
there's a
that's
problem.
a fairly affluent subgroup of the Brazilian population, isn't it?
Sorry?
There's a I mean, there are millions of Brazilians who are just as affluent as the average Swiss or the average American, isn't that right? It's a small percentage of the population, but there's still 10 or 20 million people, I think.
That's very less than in Switzerland and in the United States.
Well, less than in the United States, but not less than in Switzerland, because the whole population of Switzerland is what, I don't know, 5 million, 8 million? I would have thought there's more affluent people in Brazil than that.
Brazil doesn't have more than 5 million millionaires.
Not millionaires, no, I don't think so. Well, millionaire, okay, maybe Switzerland has 5 million millionaires. Maybe if you own a house in Switzerland, you're probably a millionaire, I guess, given real estate prices.
Well,
Okay, sorry,
sorry to my country. Every corner, in almost every corner, you can find a beggar child, asking for money. And you can give money every corner if you want, but it doesn't change nothing.
Of
You know?
course, but that's a different.
Sometimes even that their parents are like using, the child to be the beggars, because people are more likely to give money to the child than to the elders. So I really think that poverty is not only an ethical question. It's mainly a political question. Poverty is constitutive of capitalism. If you don't change capitalism, you won't change poverty. Just by giving money for someone, you won't change poverty. Let me go a little more further. The day before yesterday, some of my friends and even my fiancé were robbed. I mean, violently robbed. A guy with a knife came, so they gave all they have to this guy. And one of my friends, which was a boy, wasn't wanting to give his wallet. And the guy was he was almost doing it, with a knife. And so he finally dropped the wallet, dropped off the wallet, some meters far from where they were. And the robber, he just pulled over the wallet, and he left the place. I mean, that's the image, of what means giving money for poor people by thinking that you are saving them. This poor guy, he thought that getting this wallet, you would be very bad, but not. Tomorrow, after tomorrow, you will be doing the same thing, So I really think that we need to change how economy works. Maybe a life which is not mediatized, and now I will be very philosophical, but a life that is not mediatized by money, could eliminate poverty. But
Do you know anywhere where that's
if you
the
have
case?
money, I think it's very difficult to get a solution.
Do you know of any large-scale economy in the world where there isn't money?
Sorry?
You seem to suggest that the solution to poverty is to eliminate money. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah.
But do you know anywhere in the world that operates without money?
No.
So isn't this just a utopian dream?
Maybe, but sometimes we need utopia too.
I mean,
Sorry, David hasn't said his hand up for a while.
Sure. I'm wondering if,
I think that by giving money, you are only helping your consciousness to get lighter.
Oh, no.
You're not really helping the other people.
I mean, I gave you my example, okay? And there are millions of such examples, right? I mean, there are different organizations that do different things.
Changes. It was only temporary,
Well, of course.
I mean, for some time, to buy something to eat, it really helps. But in the day after, what about the day after? And the day after,
Well, they actually helped us as long as at some point the crisis went away and there were some things in the shop, and they stopped helping us. They actually, the family that I was talking about, helped some people in Romania, and then again it changed, and then again they stopped, and again helped some other people.
But the crisis didn't go away because of clarity, you know. It was something else that changed the situation.
They helped us, right? I mean, they helped us living a comfortable, good life, right? So not to, not to stand, I don't know, 12 hours in a queue for anything.
Okay,
and so
it's
on.
the same thing.
Okay,
For
so they helped us.
short-term
Meanwhile,
situations,
the political
works.
situation changed, fortunately. But I don't think that they did it.
For short-term situations, it works, you know.
But how
But
would
for
they know
long-term
then that
situations,
it would be a short-term situation? We had communism for, over 30 years then. And in 80s, I don't think that anyone would think that the communism will end in 8 years, right? I mean, if you lived at that time and watched television, then you would know that in 89, it was incredible that Germany united, that communism broke out and so on. I mean,
think
who
that
would
the
expect it?
situation in DDR was very different from the situation in Brazil nowadays, for example. I mean, that was very better, you know. Even if they were the second world, it's not so bad as in Brazil, in South America, or in Africa, or...
Yes, I'm sure. I mean, therefore, I said that no one was dying out of hunger. But would you think that it was wrong of them to help us?
No, that's all right, but it doesn't change, and it doesn't change the situation.
But there are
it changes
different,
the point.
there are different things. Okay? I mean, one is what to do in a global scene, right? I mean, with politics and so on. That's a huge and very important question. But the other question is that actual people that have a name are dying out of hunger. And if I can help them, and there are different things, yes, so I can have this virtual adaptation, adopt a child.
Oh,
to
right,
certain
right, yes,
organization,
right.
And you can help a person with a
I
name,
don't
you know
let
what he
just
has.
they die, you know. Maybe nature could do something, you know. If everything is moral, maybe nature, you know, occupying itself by letting people dying for hungry.
But do we think that
resolve
do we think that that's
question
good?
in a moral way?
Sorry, I don't understand the relevance of the fact that some deaths are natural. Does that make them good in some way, are you suggesting? Or that they don't matter because they occur in natural ways?
I mean, surely we do not claim that
I
everything
mean,
is moral.
if nature itself is moral,
No, who said it is? Did we ever say nature is moral?
yesterday wasn't really saying that. Oh, I'm sorry, I get it totally
No,
wrong.
we can talk about it if you want, but
No. David, yes, you did.
I wonder if we could go a different direction, maybe come back to that initial question of whether the analogy holds. I'm wondering if at some point we don't need to include an indexical argument to our argument for charitable giving, because it seems to me that there's a challenge in moving from one ought to do something to I ought to do something. You think of Perry's example of being in the supermarket with a sack of sugar and thinking somebody ought to clean that up, and then you finally realize, oh, I am the person who ought to clean up that mess. In a sense, the terrible story of the girl in China, hundreds of passers-by walking past her, there's a sense in which they're behaving rationally. They could all think to themselves, one ought to do something, but I'm one of 100 actors who is in a position to do something. It wouldn't be necessarily rational for me to be the one to do something. It seems to me that we need some way of making that jump. And I'm wondering if, in some regard, the analogy between the two cases, saving the dying child, where I am the only one around, and I can think to myself, one ought to do something, and I am the only one that can do something at this point, versus learning that at a modest cost to myself, I can assist a dying child in Africa. One ought to do something, I think, after I watched the TV documentary, but I don't know the inference succeeds in saying, and I am that one that ought to do something. Should there be an external element at some point introduced, makes it incumbent not just upon one to behave rationally, but upon me to behave rationally. Does that make sense?
I understand exactly what the point you're raising, but I suppose I would put the onus the other way around. Is there any reason why it ought not to be me? Is there any reason why there's someone else who should do it in place of me?
Well, you can imagine that, you know, you see the documentary saying for $5 a day, such and such, and thinking it would be rational for someone who is better off than me, if only they would act. It would be rational for me to do so. It would be even more rational for Bill Gates to do more than he's doing. So it wouldn't be irrational for me to be the one who sends in the check, but it would be optimal if other people in a better position were to do such, because it would come at an even more modest cost to them than it would to me. So you see what I mean? I mean, it seems to me that we need the force of the indexical at some point to sort of force me as an individual to respond, and not simply as a rational being who is aware of the need.
Yeah, I certainly see what you're saying. But and perhaps this is a point at which I start to look at it in a utilitarian way as a consequentialist. I would say, what difference will it make if I do it, right? So let's say it's true that Bill Gates could give even more, because although Bill Gates has been incredibly generous by standards of philanthropy as they prevail, he's still many times richer than I am. And of course there are many other people who are many times richer than I am, and some of them are not even doing anything positive like Bill Gates. So I could certainly say the case is even stronger for these people. But they're not actually doing anything, or they're certainly not doing very much. Given what they are doing, given how little they're doing, there is a need for more to be done. So if that's the case, and if the other factual premises that I put forward are true, and I know they've been challenged, but if we just assume for the moment that that's the case, then if I give the cost of an expensive pair of shoes, or whatever the sum is, that will make a difference to some child, right, or to some family. And that's the reason I would think that it's still the case that I ought to do it, even if there is an even stronger obligation on billionaires X, Y, and Z who are doing very little.
I guess I'm just wondering if there are necessary and sufficient conditions that have to be fulfilled for me to recognize that I occupy, in fact, the role of one who should give. I mean, from a common sense perspective, obviously I recognize that I do have X amount of dollars, the cost to me is modest, the benefit to them is great, but I'm just wondering if in logical terms, we need a way of being able to really spell that out and make it explicit.
Well, for the consequentialist, that's enough. Now, there may be other moral views that might be interesting to explore, where they may not be true. But for the consequentialist, it's enough to say, so let's say I have this amount of disposable income. So I have $1,000, let's say, that I have the option of giving to one of the effective aid organisations, or I have the option of, I don't know, spending on a holiday in Switzerland. So I ought to weigh up the costs and benefits of doing those two things. And this is something we can talk about more. We talked about it a little bit yesterday. And if I weigh them up impartially, giving equal weight to the interests of all of those affected, it seems that $1,000 does much more good on the whole, benefits, let's say, 20 people by a life-changing difference, whereas for me, well, yes, I'll have had one pleasant week in the Swiss Alps, but that's not making such a difference to me. There's a lot more things we can talk about. There were a few more hands.
I think one of the problems, is the problem of money itself, and I think, you said Thiago's solution of an economy without money was utopian. I think it might be equally utopian to think that without getting rid of a capitalist system that incentivizes improving your own condition as much that the problem of poverty will ever go away. I think part of it is the problem of money in itself is money is like is an abstract sort of relation of power to the extent that, like, let's say I go buy a coffee, right? My money goes to, I don't know, Starbucks. Some of it might go to, paying a fair trade farmer. Some of it goes to the CEO of the company or something. Let's say the CEO one night decides to hire a prostitute from some other country. Like I have no control over what anyone does with money the minute I use it. And so, I might be funding the sex trade at the same time that I'm funding, global poverty. And I mean, now in your case, that I think that without pretending to know the situation either in Poland or in Brazil, I think one thing that was different, you said that they send goods, right? I would way rather see something that says, hey, send a package of goods or something, because again, that takes you one step away from the problem of money. And the only other thing I was thinking of was, I know a lot of times what this tends to do is, we discuss the problems in these terms, and I think it's a bit dehumanizing for the poor, to the sense that the first thing we consider about them is their economic condition of not having money. And I know that, like for example, a lot of times, we'll go over for a short-term trip or something to help out to build a shelter or something like that. I actually met somebody who had done one of these sort of short-term trips, and what they said, they came back and I asked them, so how was it? And what they said to me was just, characteristic of this. They said, it was all right. And I said, what? And they said, yeah, well, I thought we were going to really do something like build a huge shelter or something like that. They just wanted to talk. And it's like the people kind of just wanted to hang out and get to know them. And they're like, no, but you're poor, we're here to help you. But they just said, no, I just want to hang out, we're okay, and so I think, it's important somehow to not let the poverty of the people become the primary characteristic of them. And that's, I think the problem is that a system can't really do that. It's a systemic giving effort can't really take care of that.
Well, so certainly I'm not suggesting that we should impose any programs on the poor that they don't themselves want, and good aid organisations don't work that way. I mean, they have people in the areas where people are poor, and they talk to organisations and they see what sorts of things they want and how it will make a difference. So that's part of it. The other thing I want to say, because it relates to some of the things that have come up, is you said, I think at one point too, unless we change the system in some way, the poor are going to always be with us. But I think I'm not looking at it in terms of eliminating global poverty. I mean, that would be wonderful if we could do it. But I'm thinking a bit more, as Katarzyna said, of helping specific people. So Katarzyna mentioned her situation in Poland. I'll mention a specific program that I visited that Oxfam was running in Pune in India, which they were doing together with an academic at university in Pune, a woman, who had been studying women from the, probably best known as the untouchable class. They don't use the word untouchables now in India, but the lowest caste, which to whom is left very unpleasant tasks. And this woman was studying a group of women who were working in the Pune garbage tip, refuse tip, that all of the rubbish from it's a large city, all of the rubbish from the city was taken. And they were going through, the trucks would come and dump it on the tip, and they were going through that, searching for stuff that they could be recycled, that they could sell. And I went out there and visited them. There was actually a camera crew going around with me, but the director wouldn't even get out of there was a Land Rover that the camera crew had. This was not an aid organisation. The director wouldn't even get out of the air-conditioned Land Rover because it was A, hot, and B, there was an extremely offensive odour, as you'd expect in those sort of places. But these women were searching through all this stuff and pulling out, not just the obvious things like aluminium cans and bottles, which were recycled here, but even plastic bags were recyclable, used plastic bags. They were basically having very poor working conditions. Secondly, they were getting very little money for this, and one of the reasons they were getting very little money for this was that they had to sell it to a small group of dealers in the town. The dealers basically formed a monopoly or a cabal. They colluded among themselves to drive the prices of these materials very low. Some of them also demanded sexual favours from the women if they were to buy the stuff at all, and the women were really completely disempowered. So the academic I was talking to made a proposal to Oxfam, who had worked out other schemes in the area, and they came in and essentially made it possible for the women to organise themselves, really to unionise themselves, you could say, although they were not unionising themselves against any employer, but they were unionising themselves against the dealers, firstly, and secondly, to represent them at the city council. Because one of the obvious solutions to the horrible nature of the work they were doing is to have people separate their recyclables at the point where they're giving them away. And this seemed obvious, but it wasn't obvious because these women were not allowed into the apartment complexes where middle-class people live. So they had to negotiate with the city to do that. And at the time I was there, the project had been running a few years, and these tasks had basically been accomplished. As I said, there were still some women actually working on the tip because not everything got separated. But they weren't doing that all the time. Women would say to us, yes, I'm working on the tip today, but tomorrow I'll be going around the apartment buildings and that's a lot neater and cleaner. They were getting better money, they were getting protected from sexual harassment. And I attended a meeting at which the Oxfam person was there, and they said, thank you very much for your help. I think we're okay now. I think we're independent. We don't really need any further assistance from you because we have got ourselves organised and we can go ahead. So, that's a small program. It didn't eliminate poverty in Puna. It didn't even eliminate poverty in the Untouchables. But it certainly improved the lives of, I don't know how many women there were, but scores of women anyway. It improved them significantly. So I think that's worth doing. Even if you say, well, poverty is going to continue in India, it seems to me that however much I am a donor to Oxfam, I don't know whether my donation went to that, but if it did, I'm sure it did much more good than whatever it would have done if I'd spent it.
I mean, I think your intentions are great, but again, on Josh's point, like, for example, like your computer, our cell phones, like all of our clothes pretty much are made in, like, if having a bachelor's in economics taught me anything, it's that my life is supported by practical slavery elsewhere. And like, you know what I mean? Like there's, for example, in every computer or cell phone, there's coltan, which is a mineral mined in Congo, where the multinational corporations go in there and they contract with whoever's in charge of the government at the time, and whoever's in charge of the government says, okay, we're going to get money for this mineral, so go out and shoot whoever you have to get everyone to mine stuff for us. And so just buying one computer easily outweighs whatever giving it. Like, you know what I mean?
But I don't understand why it's either or, right? I mean, if we could, I agree we ought to do something about the coltan example is a specific instance of what's sometimes called the resource curse, the way in which we take part in getting minerals and resources from countries where we know that what the multinationals are paying is not going to help the people of the country, but is going to enrich the rulers of the country. That's a problem. I agree. And again, it's a little bit like what I said before. If you want to say I'm not going to give to charities because I'm going to work with organisations like Transparency International to make sure that multinationals reveal all the details of the deals they do with dictators, so that consumers can see what they're funding, and therefore we can work to have consumers boycott products that are treated in this way. I have no objection to that, but I don't see why it's a choice. I don't see why the fact that I'm using a computer that contains coltan that was obtained in exploitative conditions is a reason why I should not be giving to Oxfam.
Well, I'm not saying it's a choice, and I don't think most of us are, but what I'm saying is I think it's naive to think that you're actually helping, like that your participation is more help than the problem you're causing by using the computer or the clothes made in factories in other countries. You know what I mean?
They're just different, aren't they?
Isn't it that if you do not help, then you will be only on the bad side, right? At least.
Right. I mean, it's like this. It's like the way I see it, and again, this is the whole being wrapped up in the economy through money kind of thing. Like it implicates in everything. Like it's as if here's the scale, right? Our lifestyle piles like millions and millions of pounds over here, and then we say, okay, let's put like $5 over here and try to balance it out. Like our lifestyle, just the way we live, perpetuates the things that now we're trying to say, oh yeah, by the way, let's maybe take a little bit off of there.
Well, we can narrow the gap.
Right.
That's the argument.
Right.
And I think you can be, your economics are completely clear, but the issue is, and the Poland example, all that is about narrowing the gap, and to just go, oh, it's a big mountain of, bullshit and capitalism and so forth. We're hot, it's spitting into the ocean and all these things. It's true, but I think the point, the overall point here is to narrow the gap, and I think that is within our means. It's not going to cure the problem. It's not going to, make the world perfect or any of these things, but I do believe, and I can't believe anyone here wouldn't believe that the gap can be narrowed.
Well, the question is in whether procuring the resources that you give to narrow the gap, you actually make the gap larger.
Right, and I mean that's like.
But sorry, I don't understand. I mean, I'm not procuring the resources in order to give the gift, right? If I've got the resources anyway, right? So you could be saying, look, you shouldn't have the resources. It's wrong that you have the resources. You should go somewhere out in the bush. You should live a completely self-sustaining life, and then you would not be harming anyone. True, you would not have any money to give away, but the balance would be better because you're not harming anyone. So if anybody takes that, that's a view you can take. But if I'm going to have the computer anyway, then it still seems to be better, isn't it, if I give some of the money that I earn?
I think we're talking about two different things here. We're talking about, one, helping people out in a direct way, like the case in Poland. And I don't think anybody really disagrees that helping somebody out, just like saving the kid in the pond, is a worthy thing to do. But the other thing, that is not taking care of poverty, and in a way, the way that it operates, if that's supposed to be taking care of poverty, it's sort of going at it possibly, I don't know, and it's just a question that I have to ask, is this a war on poverty? Sort of in the same way that we have a war on drugs and we have a war on terror, and it's ineffective. It's effective in a very particular case, but, and like you were saying, yes, it does help to close the gap, but it doesn't really address the problem.
No, I didn't say that.
No, you said to close the gap.
But I did not say in attempting to close the gap that it does not address the problem.
That's mine.
That's your point.
Yeah, that's mine.
But
I'm just saying that you said that it was attempting to close the gap. That's good. But I don't think it's necessarily addressing the problem. Is what I'm hearing from other people. Is that we, in other words, we have two different problems here. We have a problem of trying to address specific situations, and the problem of solving poverty, the problem of poverty. And
But we weren't really talking about the problem of poverty. You've introduced the problem of poverty. We were talking about helping that's why I started with helping this child in the pond, and then I said, how is this different from not helping some of the 8 million children who are going to die from avoidable poverty-related causes? I didn't talk about how is this different from not solving the problem of poverty.
I'm not saying that you brought it up. I'm saying that's what I'm hearing in the discussion.
Right. Good point.
Okay.
Good.
So and we're all involved in the discussion. So,
yeah, absolutely. No, that's good.
So I haven't heard you refute it either.
You've made it more explicit, which is good. You've made it more explicit, I think, which is a good thing. Maybe that you've clarified that some people around the table are having a discussion about how can we solve the problem of poverty? How can we have a world without poverty? and others are talking about how can we help some people who are in great need.
No, I think we're all having those two conversations.
Okay.
I don't think some people are having one conversation, some people are having the other conversation.
Okay.
I just think that, I'm just bringing up the fact that we are having those two conversations, but they're getting kind of blurred.
Intermingled. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Good point. Right. I don't know. We'll go.
So one of the issues, it seems, is total information, and I think that a lot of us, including myself, have a lot of homework to do in relation to what our or the relation of our consumption to particular countries, particular people. I know there are people studying this. I have not read their studies, but there are people that do trace the constituent parts of our computers to, our marketplace and draw those lines. So I think that's something worth studying. The other thing I wanted to mention is that was an exceptional case, and it's wonderful that that project worked. As a counterexample, I think I saw at least 15 projects that failed after 1 year in situ. So there's something about these organizations not doing their homework. And these were reputable organizations that you would think would by now have figured out after 30 years in Lesotho that certain things work and certain things don't. But there's a certain aspect of them not needing to do that. The money will continue coming in. They can have their experiments. They can see what works. And what's the need for doing
Okay,
homework?
that's a terrific point. Let me just answer that one. I'd like us then to have a more general discussion about the other one, about the significance of trying to trace where elements of our consumer lifestyle come from. Why do I do that? There is an organisation which was set up not that long ago. I don't know now, maybe sometime maybe 5 to 8 years ago, called GiveWell. I don't know whether I mentioned it in the New York Times article or not. Anyway, you can find it online, givewell.org. It was set up by...
If you are online, you can do it.
If you're online, you can do it now if you like. So it was set up by a couple of young guys who were working for a hedge fund at a time when hedge funds were making huge amounts of money. And they decided they wanted to give some of these large amounts of money away. And so they formed a little group and said, let's think about where we can give effectively. So they contacted a few organisations and basically said, what will you do with our money if we were to give you some money? And they got back glossy brochures of smiling children and vague information about how we're working to provide clean water for these people and sanitation for that and skills for this. But none of it was really going into specifics. And these are people who are used to analysing companies in great detail, so to decide whether their hedge fund should or should not invest in them. And they thought that this was a bit strange. But I think, you put your finger on why it happens, because that's unfortunately been the level of information that most people require to enable them to give. So they said, well, we don't think that's good enough. So they started contacting other organisations saying, we need more information on that. And a very, very small percentage were prepared to work with them, to actually give them the kind of detail they needed about, suppose we were to give you $10,000, what would you do with it? How could you show us that it made a difference? So instead of actually just giving the money at the start, they decided to actually start an organisation that would evaluate charities on this basis. Specifically, they didn't initially start out just to do charities helping the global poor, but that's what they ended up doing because they decided that was more effective than anything else that they could give to. And they asked people to donate to them so that they could set up a kind of prize that they would give to the organisation that could most clearly demonstrate that a donation to them of, say, $10,000 would save X lives. And, firstly, the demonstration had to be clear. Secondly, obviously, the larger X was, the better. So they were actually trying to create an incentive for these organisations to get beyond the situation that you described, get beyond the situation where they can have failures and it doesn't really matter, it doesn't really affect how much money they raise because their donors aren't really well informed enough to know what they're doing and whether the projects fail. And GiveWell has been, you know, a reasonable success at this stage, I would say. It's still fairly early days, but they have been building up their research, and they've also been building up the amount of money that they influence. So it's now, I don't remember what the latest figures are, but it's certainly now in the multi-million-dollar amounts that they can direct by saying X is our top-rated charity for this year. I think currently it's the Against Malaria Fund. By saying that Against the Malaria Fund is our top-rated charity for this year, that gives the Against Malaria Fund millions of dollars more than it would have had if it was not top-rated. And you know, they can document that because they ask the donors to state why they're giving. So I do agree with you that a lot of NGOs have got away with too much, and I hope that that's changing. And I think if you're interested in helping to change that, then you know, looking at what GiveWell does, giving to their top-rated charities, and telling them that you're giving because they've been able to demonstrate transparently to GiveWell what they're doing, is one way of transforming that charitable field. Okay, so then there's a few other things. I do want to come back to this question about our consuming lifestyle and what we ought to do about that, but if we've got shorter questions, because we're getting close to the break, if we've got shorter questions, maybe we'll take them.
Well, this is a bit different, but I think that one of the problems is that in the act of gift giving, we create this dependency complex where the receiver, you know, they feel like they're lower, and that as a gift giver, you know, you might feel like you're higher. I mean, my wife and I, we give a very modest sum to an organization, but I don't really feel comfortable with that. And it's kind of like, I mean, I understand that it's helpful to give money to immediately help the people, but I feel like it somehow hinders their independence. For instance, like I come from South Korea, and we were a very poor country, and now we're one of the richer nations. And you know, like I have hay fever, so I go to the pharmacy and I buy allergy medicine, and it's like maybe $1.50, you know, like US $1.50. I went to the Philippines and I went to one of the provinces, and you know, my allergy started acting up. I went to a pharmacy, and I had to pay like about $12 US for the same medicine, and like they were big, and the Philippines is a lot poorer than South Korea, especially in the provinces, and you know, it wasn't Manila the capital, and they were paying prices. They were paying for their pharmaceuticals like what you pay in Western Europe, I assume. And I think a lot of this might have to do with this. I mean, you know, like South Korea, when you know, after the war, they were very poor, and they were getting donations and aid and stuff like that. And you know, one of their biggest exports is like women's hair. But what they did is, you know, they protected their economy, and then they started to develop in key industries. So, you know, like the reason why in Korea it's $1.50 is that, you know, it's made in Korea, and you know, that's where it is. Whereas in the Philippines, the medicine that I got, it was from the U.S. pharmaceutical company. There were no Filipino pharmaceutical companies by that. So, but the thing is that, like, you know, there's that. Like going back, you know, I don't know, you know, about Oxfam. I mean, I know about them, I've heard of them, but I don't know specifically. But even if they're not connected to, you know, multinationals in any way, I think that there's this dependency complex where, you know, they feel like, okay, you know, we're getting gifts, like, you know, from these people from these nations. We're getting money from them, and they feel that the way for them to move up is to have this alliance with these countries, which I think that multinational corporations can take advantage of that, and they don't help. So, like, the thing is okay, I know, like, you know, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, you know, they give a lot of money. I think that's great, and it's helping millions of lives. I definitely agree with that. But the question is like, would that money go to, say, building a competitor, which I think would really help that country and that community?
Okay, I mean, I don't know how you would do that. I'm a bit surprised that if the South Korean pharmaceuticals can produce the drug for $1.50, I don't know why they don't export it to the Philippines and undercut the US corporations there. I'm not sure, but yeah, I guess I do think that's a
there's
separate
no
issue.
free trade agreement currently with But I mean, even with free trade agreement, then there's problems as well, you know.
Philippines is part of WTO, isn't it? I think they can't prevent.
I don't think there's a trade agreement with Korea now, but even if there was, then they would create other problems too, like Samsung and Hyundai, then they would go and create other problems as well.
Okay, anybody else want to make a couple of short comments before we break, and then we'll come back to some of the larger issues?
Sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay. Just a quick kind of, I recognize, before I don't want to try to implicate us in trying to solve all global poverty and stuff, but I guess what I'm trying to argue, it sounds to me like we have a view of our lifestyle, right? And we're saying like, okay, well, if it's reasonable and rational for us to do what we can without altering our lifestyle to help global poverty. And I guess kind of what I'm arguing is like, why then wouldn't it be rational to alter our lifestyle even more for the sake of the, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, I know what you mean.
like it just sounds like we're kind of saying it's almost a why stop there if we actually, for the sake of these people, like the $10, you know what I mean? Like on that calculus kind of thing. Like if my resources that I use here would easily be like the $10 for me would be way more for somebody else. It almost leads to a we should just keep giving until we bring in.
Well, that's one of the questions that I wanted us to get to in the second half, over how demanding are the implications of this view if you accept it, but since there are a lot of people not accepting the view at all, I thought it was a bit premature to get to the point of how demanding it is.
Right.
But suggestions about changing our lifestyle, of course, are also very demanding, and I do want to, so maybe we'll come to that in the second half.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.